Welcome to Ever Onward. This week is a part 2 series. We have Brad Johnson, who was a mission president in the Pennsylvania Pittsburgh Mission. And last week, he shared a lot of inspiration and good thoughts with us. And we are taking up where we left off last time. And we're here with part 2. So thanks so much for coming again.
My pleasure, Katie. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about this subject that I'm so passionate about.
Yeah, it's so needed, and what a unique perspective you have. You shared last week how you've had perspectives from all sides, mission president, stake president of YSA. You served a mission yourself, so we're so happy to be able to glean whatever wisdom you have.
Yeah, it may not be much, but I'm happy to talk about it and share it.
Awesome. Well, for this episode, I just kind of wanted to focus on advice that you have for people in different parts of this missionary work. So starting off, what advice would you give to those that are preparing for a mission?
Well, I'd go back to something we talked about earlier and say, be realistic about your expectations and understand that this will be difficult. It will, in all likelihood, be the hardest thing you've ever done to that point in your life. And great things will come of it. But if you have a more realistic expectation, that will be helpful. And I would say familiarize yourself with the scriptures and preach my gospel. I think preach my gospel is such a inspired and valuable tool that sometimes missionaries or potential missionaries, they lose sight of where they ought to focus their efforts. And the scriptures and preach my gospel would be the best place they could serve their time. One of the challenges that we had in my mission as a mission president, we received iPads after the first year we were there. And the iPads opened up this library, the gospel library, to every missionary, which had every ensign, New Era that had been published since 1970, all the general conference talks going back to the 19th century. There's this almost unlimited wealth of great information that sometimes the missionaries wanted to read all of that, and they'd forget that where they ought to be focusing their efforts was preach my gospel and the scriptures, and not on all those other things, not to minimize how important they are, but go back and read the letter from the first presidency at the very start of Preach My Gospel. It says that missionaries should use it daily. And that is great preparation for missionaries who are about to go out. Now, there's some social things. If they'll spend some time away from home, that can be helpful. If they can learn little chores that they need to do, not so little chores like cooking and taking care of laundry and things that they'll have to do as missionaries, those can all be helpful. But the spiritual preparation can be the best thing for them.
Oh, I love that. And you mentioned having realistic expectations and knowing it will be hard. And I think that one of the things I love about the Missionary Wellness Center is that we help teach coping skills so that when it does get hard, you have some tools in your back pocket. For a lot of missionaries, once they get out there, that's the first time that they've been hit with anxiety bigger than they know what to do with, or maybe more than just a hard day, maybe a little depression, or when the homesickness really packs hard. Some of those things can really kind of knock you off, feel like it's knocking off your feet. And I think spending some time preparing mentally and getting some coping skills that you know how to practice before you get out there.
Absolutely. I would say almost guaranteed, a missionary will have those hard times. They will have to deal with things that they haven't had to deal with before. And those coping, whatever it is that they use to cope, it may have been the music that they love that isn't appropriate for missionaries, or video games, or they're talking to their parents for an hour a day, or their best friends. That's not available anymore. And now you've got to come back to things that will be different. And if you can go out understanding that and have those skills, and by the way, the classes that you give here at the Pause Wellness for missionaries about to serve can be priceless.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your support on that. Yeah, I think anything missionaries can do to prepare spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, learning how to cook, will set them up for success.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what about parents who have kids that are out and they're struggling? I can speak from experience. I didn't serve a mission, but I have been the parent of missionaries, and it is harder than I even imagined, being halfway around the world and not knowing where your place is anymore, and trying to trust the process and let them fly, but hoping they don't fall on their face. So what advice can you give to parents?
Yeah. I would say first, understand that they're not alone. That my favorite scripture is found in section 84 when the Lord says, I'll be on your right hand and your left hand, and mine angels round about to bear you up. That will happen with their missionaries, and they need to trust that the Lord is there and that there are angels on the other side of the veil and angels on this side of the veil that will help and bless their missionaries. Second, understand that, as we've discussed, missions are difficult, and that's a good thing. I can remember when our first month when my wife and I served as mission leaders, how hard it was for her to see the difficulties that these missionaries were going through. And we'd had missionaries, some of our children, that had served missions, and we'd seen that. But here it's right in your face, and you're dealing with it. And when she realized that letting them work through those problems and challenges many times was the right answer. And parents need to realize that. Let those missionaries get through it and let them learn the lessons that come by doing it on their own and with the help of their Father in heaven can be extremely valuable. I was always just a little concerned when I'd sit down with missionaries for the first time, and I'd always ask, well, what are you concerned about what are you anxious about as you go into the mission? And usually they'd be very candid with me and tell me what their concerns were. But sometimes missionaries would say, well, I've got this. I'm not worried at all. And I think to myself, we'll see. The Lord will humble him or her. It just takes time, and missions will do that. And parents need to understand that that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, let me say that there were times when I didn't know what was going on with those 200 plus, and when we got out there were 260 missionaries. And sometimes I couldn't see everything that was going on. I needed to know from a parent if a missionary was really struggling. And I valued them letting me know. If you're a missionary, it's more than just homesickness or something. If there's something serious going on, tell your mission president. And by no means do I mean to meddle. And there are parents that meddle, and that's difficult. But sometimes a parent needs to step in and let the mission president know.
Yeah. Oh, that's such good advice. Yeah, it's hard to differentiate yourself, when your child's home, you're used to taking on their problems and you're used to facing them together side by side. And then you go on the mission, you send them on a mission, and it feels like you're turning them over to the Lord and saying, okay, they're yours now. Please watch over them. Please help them. Please guide them. So
yeah, it's that's not an easy phase of parenting for many parents, is to watch what happens and the challenges that they go through. And sometimes missionaries are advised never to write home anything negative to their parents. And boy, I never believed that. I never felt like that was good counsel.
Yeah.
I think it's good to share some of the challenge, for those missionaries to share some of the challenges. And parents I would hope that parents would help them see the positive things that come from the difficult challenges that they're going through. And they can be a source of support, and they can help pray for those missionaries and the specific things that they're dealing with. And I hope that the missionaries don't just always say, oh, listen, or the parents don't just say, just blow off the challenges that the missionaries are dealing with. At the risk of being just a little personal here, when I shared earlier how my mission was the hardest thing I've ever done at 68 years old now. I shared that with my parents. And my mom, I was the second missionary she had. She had 8 children too, and I was the second missionary. And she did not want to see me having hard times, and she wasn't sure that that was the way it was supposed to be, and she wasn't always sympathetic that during that early part of my mission. Well, fast forward 7 or 8 years, and my mom and dad served as a senior couple in Germany. And I can remember her telling me, I'm sorry that I wasn't a little more sympathetic, because she could see what these young missionaries were going through. And that was a tender moment for her and for me to see that she recognized that those difficulties were hard. And it isn't easy to be that young missionary. And sometimes parents don't realize that.
Yeah. And to find ways as a parent to be okay with them struggling, and to not feel like they don't adopt that anxiety themselves, that we can still be okay and grounded while they're struggling out there.
Yes. And by the way, can I just say that I was blessed with the best mother possible, except my wife. My mother was amazing. But this was one thing that she needed to learn as a parent.
Yeah. I mean, the best parents still learn things as they go, right?
Yes.
We don't, just like missionaries don't get a super cape, parents don't either. We still have to learn and struggle.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I love that we're able to talk about the reality of why and how missions are hard, and how that can be a beautiful thing and something that is consecrated. And I think one myth that sometimes people have is that struggle is consecrated and beautiful if you make it the whole 18 months or you make it the whole 24 months. But I think that struggle can still be beautiful and consecrated even if missionaries come home early. And I wondered if you would be willing to speak to that.
Absolutely. While we were serving in Pennsylvania, now President Holland, then Elder Holland, did a little 3 or 4 minute clip on missionaries coming home early that was so powerful. And he made this point that sometimes missionaries are called for, they don't get to serve the full 18 months. They serve for 2 months or 3 months, but if they've served, that's their mission. And that's a hard thing for missionaries who return home early to fully understand. And I wish they would all understand that. And there were, in our 658 missionaries that came home, or that served with us, over 50 of them came home before their 18 or 24 months. And some of those were among the best missionaries we served with. They learned the things that the Lord needed them to learn during their mission. They were highly successful missionaries, and I wish they could all understand that. As a YSA stake president, I saw too many come home early and feel like failures, and that brought heartache to them, to their parents, to their priesthood leaders. That was just hard, and I hope that eventually they'll be able to see that they served their time.
Yeah. And the struggle that they had, even though it was a big enough struggle that they came home early, that is not exempt from being consecrated and turning
Absolutely.
into something beautiful.
Yes, and it will be something that they can reflect on. I am overjoyed when we have mission reunions and missionaries come that serve a short period of time, and we usually have many of them that come because they appreciate and realize that they are every bit a Pennsylvania Pittsburgh missionary if they serve for 3 weeks than the ones that serve for 24 months.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. How about advice for missionaries that are returning home and trying to get back into a normal life? I've noticed that phrase, be in the world but not of the world. And I think that's really hard for missionaries because they've put the world on hold for a while and now they're supposed to come back into it. And it's hard to navigate that.
It is not an easy time. Katie, I had this moment early in my time as a mission president when I learned a great lesson. I remember the first groups of missionaries that we sent home as they'd completed their mission. There were many of them that were highly anxious about going home, and I could not relate to that. I couldn't understand that. I remember how excited I was to go home as a missionary, and I thought, how can this be? And then I realized that for many of them, this was a safe place. They had found some joy and happiness that they had never found in their lives. And now they were going back to a place, and maybe back to a situation where they had dealt with some very hard things. And I just didn't appreciate that with those first groups that had gone out. And some of them had dealt with temptations that they'd worked hard to overcome, and that had happened during their mission. Now they knew they were going back and were going to be exposed, and were afraid of that. And that was very legitimate. And what I would counsel is, don't forget those lessons that you learned as a missionary and what you taught as a missionary. We taught those very basic things to every investigator friend. We call them friends now. In my time, they were investigators. We taught these same principles to members and less active members, that they needed to pray daily. They needed to read the scriptures daily. They needed to go to church, to serve, and go to the temple. And those very simple lessons were applicable to every one of those people that they taught as missionaries. And by the way, they were every bit as applicable to me and to each missionary. And if they'll do those things, they'll be fine. They'll have some ups and downs, and that will happen as you return home. But if you'll continue on that path, that covenant path that President Nelson talks about, they'll get through those hard times that happen after their mission, just as they got through the hard times during their mission.
Yeah. And life is a process, right? We evolve and we bloom at different stages, and there's a time and a season for everything. So on your mission, you live differently and maybe you feel differently, but when you come home, even though it's different, it doesn't mean that you've somehow stepped down a few pegs in your spirituality or your relationship to God, that it's still there. It's just a time and a season to focus on other things and to move in a different direction.
Exactly. For some missionaries, it's so hard to go home and not be able to spend literally hours in the scriptures and studying in gospel study. Sometimes you can't do that in phases of your life, and the Lord doesn't expect you to do that. And we need to understand that we're on to a different phase of life, and our mission has prepared us for that phase of life, and God doesn't expect that
Yeah.
of us. That's a hard thing for many return missionaries to appreciate.
Yeah. Thinking about, what I've learned about human development as, learning to be a therapist, it's really interesting and I think inspirational to think that Heavenly Father knows human development as well. He has us get baptized at age 8, and developmentally, we aren't able to understand the difference between cause and effect before age 8. And around 18, 19, 20 is where our rooted identity becomes who we are. And I think it's not really a surprise, or it's not that it is by design that we go through these really hard missions and our identity gets rooted to God in those years. And then I can see why it would be scary to come home, though, because you don't understand the long game. And so you've finally, maybe for the first time, felt like you found your identity and you've finally figured out who you are up to that point. And now you're supposed to go home and you're afraid you're going to lose your identity. But if we can trust the process, then we realize that that was by divine design, and that now that we know who we are in God's eyes and then we have that relationship with Him, that will be the roots for the growth that we have for the rest of our life.
That is so true and so beautifully put. I was troubled when I would see return missionaries who expected that mission to be the spiritual pinnacle in their lives. And what I've learned over my almost 7 decades is that was a spiritual high point to where I was in my life, but that was by no means the spiritual high point of my life. And there were other things that happened that took me to heights that were greater than what I experienced as a full-time missionary in France and Switzerland.
Yeah. It's not the end. It's only the beginning, right?
It is, and it's a different, I haven't been able to spend the time in the scriptures that I did as a missionary, but the lessons I learned as a parent or even in the workforce, there were spiritual lessons that I learned every day that contributed to a different perspective that helped me spiritually throughout my life.
Yeah. Wow. Well, the last group of people that I would like to ask your advice on, I don't think they get a voice very much. I think that most people come home from their mission and, as you mentioned before, say, "Oh, it was the best 2 years of my life. It was great." They have no regrets. That it's something that they look back to fondly. But I do think there's a small group of people who their mission wasn't what they thought it would be, or maybe it was complicated, or maybe there was some spiritual questions that arise. I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen, and I think that there is this smaller group of people that don't often get their voice heard. So what advice do you think you could give to someone who doesn't look back at their mission with fondness?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. And as a YSA state president, I would always ask return missionaries, and I have an opportunity to interview them. I'd say, "Tell me about your mission. What did you learn?" And there were times when they would say, "My mission wasn't what I expected, man. It was a hard time for me, and I didn't get what I hoped out of that." And so I'm realistic enough to know that not only does everybody have hard times, but some of them can't or have trouble seeing beyond those hard times and embracing the good things that did come out of it. And sometimes missionaries will come home and experience something that triggers less than positive things, and they step away and say, and I've seen that with some of the missionaries that we served with, and it's always hard. I hope that they can see, despite those hard things, that they can see how they grew during their mission and how the Lord didn't abandon them, that He was with them then and He can be with them now, no matter what steps they've taken in their lives, that they can come back, that there is a place for them here, and that whatever the challenges were, the trials, the difficulties, the transgressions, that there's a place back here for them, and the Lord wants them back.
That's beautiful. That's my hope and wish for them as well. And I think that you put it more beautiful and perfectly than I could. So I really appreciate you giving them a voice, and that validation and love that you just spoke with to them. I really appreciate that.
And I've seen many come back, having gone that full circle where they've turned their back on but they've decided, hey, they've realized that wasn't the answer. That wasn't bringing me the joy and happiness that I was looking for. Just add one thing that I used to ask missionaries who were struggling, and were struggling in part because they weren't willing to do what the Lord asked them to do. Sometimes I'd sit down with them and I'd say, how's it working out for you? Are you finding the peace, the joy that you're looking for, kicking against the pricks? Does that work for you? Sometimes they'd step back and say, no, it doesn't. And that can be a turning point. So,
yeah.
One last thing I'd add there.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, Brad, I'm just so thankful that you took the time to come and talk to us today. I feel like the things you've shared both in this episode and the past episode are going to bless a lot of lives and help those that are either preparing to serve or serving, or parents that are trying to support from home. And I just really appreciate all your wisdom and your time.
Well, my pleasure. It's been great to spend this time with you, to share some thoughts, maybe some insight. Maybe it'll be helpful to someone. And God bless those missionaries and the return missionaries.
Yeah.
We love every one of them that wear that black nameplate.
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. As a nonprofit organization, we are able to provide this information for free through donations and generous support to our cause. So if you would like to learn more or would like to get involved, please visit our website, missionarywellnesscenter.org. We'll catch you next week.